Okay, welcome back. Again, my name is Jennifer Sturdy. I'm with the Center for Effective Global Action here at UC Berkeley. I'm the Program Director for the Berkeley Initiative for Transparency in the Social Sciences. So welcome back to Section 3, Field Methods, and we are in Field Organization. So we'll start off with a big question. Who cares about data collection? And of course, hopefully the answer is everyone. Typically, researchers do contract out data collection to survey firms, and many times this is due to the fact that the data collection requires very large survey samples, and researchers themselves aren't able to complete the data collection on their own. Surveying needs to be closely monitored to ensure the accuracy of measurement. And certainly that's because the quality of the data can and usually is a deciding factor for whether an impact evaluation holds any validity. And what does that mean? Well, if you don't have good data, you probably don't have a very good impact evaluation. And this is again that transition from impact evaluation design and methodologies and transitioning to the actual field work to make it happen. You might have a great RCT on paper, but if you don't have good data underlying and feeding into that impact evaluation, you probably can't trust the results of it anyway. So within field organization, we have a few topics to cover. First is field staff selection, and then field staff training, field work strategies, controlling for non-response, panel and time series surveys. So let's start off with field staff selection. Of course, just like any part of the process, it's a critical part of our field work. Keep in mind that we want to hire more candidates than we usually think we need, and that's due to dropout, which we can only assume may happen over the course of a survey, and we want to be prepared for. Have the background of your candidates defined. You know, what level of education should they have? What other characteristics are necessary to think about in terms of language and geographic, perhaps origin within a country. That can be certainly an important factor to consider when defining the sort of candidates you need for conducting the survey. Consider your setting. Of course, if you have some modules within your survey that require having men interview men and females interview females, that should certainly be taken into consideration when you think about your male to female ratio for your field staff selection. And as previously mentioned, do consider language and whether or not you require various languages to be represented on your field staff. Be very clear with yourself on the research team and with the survey firm and with the staff you're hiring about the working conditions that they will be working under in the field, and test the candidates extensively. We'll get into that in the training as well. So moving on to field staff training, a lot of experts definitely like to hammer this point home. We should think about training not as something that can be accomplished in a few days, but sometimes requires several weeks. That can include lectures on the survey, the study design itself, the survey. It can require hands-on small group sessions where within the classroom the candidates are practicing different modules of the survey, and it does require as well field practice where the entire survey firm goes out and actually practices the deployment of the field team and conducting the survey and all the stages of data collection itself. So one thing to keep in mind also is to consider the logistical requirements of your trainings. This is definitely something that has to be considered at your study design and budget development stage. how many trainers and facilitators will be needed for training over the course of how many days, what can be your venue for conducting the training, especially depending on the size of your fieldwork team. Make sure you feed your team, especially if we're talking about several weeks of training. It's a budget requirement, and certainly something that you have to include in any planning. And include a definition of the sites for field practice that are required. So moving on to fieldwork organization, of course, this is something that should be kind of thought about in parallel to designing and implementing the training. But we should think about fieldwork obviously as something that has to be very strategically organized, something that definitely has to be very well thought out and planned in advance. Depending on the size of the survey and the survey teams themselves, you may need between 3 and 4 people per site team. And each team certainly will require a leader or supervisor. And those leaders and supervisors do have a series of kind of overarching responsibilities. The first is, of course, dealing with and managing logistics and the finances of the field work. The ability to inform and really discuss the study objectives with local authorities in order to gain trust and access to communities. Depending on the context, sometimes this can be a really heavy lift for the leaders in order to ensure that data collection teams gain the access and the trust that they need to conduct the survey safely. Third, ensure that households are identified according to the research design. So again, if this is a random sample of households in a certain area, how are you going to construct that random sample? So certainly all of that needs to be defined within the study design itself, and then the leaders are responsible for implementing it. Deploy the interviewers, of course. Basically make sure that the interviewers go out into the field according to plan. And of course, and most importantly, ensure quality of the data collection itself. And of course, there are a few factors to consider for quality control. The first is supervisors can certainly rotate among their teams and observe interviews themselves. Make sure they are conducted in line with the training that was delivered and the study design and protocol itself. Supervisors should conduct checkup visits or spot checks on interviews that they cannot observe. So taking a completed questionnaire and randomly selecting a household to basically go in and revisit and spot check responses that are recorded in a survey. Supervisors can also visually review completed questionnaires daily. Of course, this is slightly different than a spot check, so you can't really verify the data in it, but this is a verification exercise of making sure the questionnaires are completed according to their layout and requirements. An additional element of quality control can be running high-frequency checks on incoming data, so having a way of conducting actually data review in the field before moving on from study locations. So in addition to quality control, of course, another fieldwork strategy is data entry. Data entry will vary depending on the mechanism that has been selected for data entry itself. So are the survey teams conducting interviews with paper surveys, in which case we may require on-site data entry workers to monitor data quality as well. Instead of paper surveys, there certainly is the option for electronic-based surveys where before going into the field, the survey firm can program the survey itself and quality control checks into the survey using programs like CS Pro. If done correctly, of course, this can save resources. You don't have to print hundreds of pages of questionnaires, and it can, with these embedded quality checks, significantly improve the data quality itself. Of course, it cannot be understated that this should be pre-tested and field tested as much as possible, because just like anything, one incorrect programming in an electronic survey could actually drastically decrease the quality of your data. So just like anything, there are no shortcuts in life. So depending on which data entry mechanism is used, be sure a lot of effort is done with pre-testing and training and working the kinks out. Moving on to field work plans. So there are two levels of plans, the work plan and the survey plan. With the work plan, this is really defined as what will each team do in each location and how long will it take to do it. Whereas the survey plan is a different level, which defines which teams will visit each location and when. So it's a higher level planning document. And these two plans should work together, but of course each are conceived of differently. The work plan should include the number of interviews per sample location. It should include the geographical scattering of sample locations and the travel time it requires to arrive at each. Next, the work plan needs to consider whether or not a list or a full census exists of our sampling unit. So if we're conducting a household survey, does a full household list of all households in the area that we are sampling exist? If not, what is required? Will the survey firm need to actually construct its own census of that area in order to select households from the full universe that exist in that area? So really a critical issue that does need to be thought about well in advance of fieldwork, and certainly has major budget implications if a list does not already exist. The work plan should also include methods of quality control that will be implemented. So as we discussed earlier, what supervisors and other quality control team members will be doing in order to ensure high quality data is collected and recorded. The work plan should take into consideration the interview duration, and of course that informs how long teams will stay in each location. It should include the estimated number of visits to each unit that is being observed. So again, if this is a household survey, the estimated number of visits that would be required to each household, and if spot checks are needed, how many would be conducted. And of course, we've talked a lot in this list about if it's a household survey, but if other questionnaires are required in the area, so for example, if we are sampling households in the general catchment area of a health facility and also need to conduct an interview at the health facility level, take that into consideration when planning the timing within the work plan. And of course, build in time to rest for the field staff themselves. That's critical to ensuring the quality of data that's collected. Now the next plan to consider is of course the survey plan, and this should include time spent by each team at sample locations. Of course, this is linked to the work plan and should be determined by it. The survey plan should include the number of sample locations, which is of course defined by the research design itself. It also includes the total time available or allowed for field work. It includes spatial and temporal distributions of the sample. And the survey plan should also take into consideration language requirements of various sampling locations. So if a field team is going to be required to respond to different local languages depending on where they are during fieldwork, this certainly has to be taken into consideration with the survey plan and with any corresponding field team composition requirements and questionnaire translation requirements. The survey plan should also include the number of field teams that are required and any other external constraints that should be considered. In many contexts, weather and seasons are major factors in planning field work, as well as holidays and other security issues. All of these should be used to inform the timeline for the survey plan itself. So our fourth factor to consider in field organization is, of course, controlling for non-response. So there are two levels of non-response to consider. The first is unit non-response, and this is when an entire observational unit is missing from the sample. So if you're conducting a household survey, this could mean you're missing information on one person, or you're missing information on a whole household that you were expecting to collect information on. Examples of reasons why you could have a unit non-response is that the household or the person cannot be found, or the individual refuses to participate. The second form of non-response is item non-response, and this is, of course, within the survey when measurements are present for an observational unit, so for an individual, but at least one measure of interest is missing. So let's say we ask a question around each individual's last level of education completed, and we only have responses from 5 of the 6 household members. And the 6th household member provides us with a doesn't know or refuses to answer that question. That is an item non-response. Both arise from similar causes, create similar concerns, and of course both have similar solutions. Okay, so to think about ways to avoid non-response, first, make sure the interview is conducted in language most comfortable to the respondent. Second, allow for enough time in each sample location. So if interviewers are trying to rush through a survey, it might be difficult to obtain all of the information required in the survey itself from each respondent. Survey teams and supervisors especially need to monitor their enumerators, and this gets into, again, the quality control factors that were discussed earlier. Also, reverting back to the issue raised earlier in terms of supervisors' responsibilities, if a survey team does not have kind of the buy-in and support from the local authorities for households and individuals to participate in the survey, individuals might be reluctant to provide responses. Also, always consider the setting that you are operating in and the goal of your survey. So in some cases, really a lot of attention needs to be paid to gender differences in terms of interview requirements. So if there are sensitive health issues being asked in a maternal and child health survey, thinking about in that context, does that require a woman to interview the women of the household, or is it okay for men to interview the women? So again, getting into kind of the gender, the balance between male and female ratio for your interview teams, and certainly understanding the sensitivity of certain topics that are being discussed and how to ensure that the interview and the interviewer are respectful of that, the sensitivity of those issues. This brings us to proxy answers. Proxy answers are when one member of the household can respond on behalf of another. This should actually not really be a solution for non-response. Again, this should be predetermined within the questionnaire design itself, whether or not proxies would provide the best quality data possible. The solution should be instead to revisit households if individuals are not available to speak during the original time of the interview. So don't just use a respondent's absence from the household as an opportunity to use a proxy. That is actually not an appropriate response. Ensure that the survey team actually revisits the household to try and interview directly the individuals that must be interviewed directly according to the questionnaire design itself. This brings us to motivation strategies, so incentives for households and individuals to participate in the survey itself. Again, this is an issue that should certainly be discussed early in study design, as it does have budget implications, and should certainly be discussed with any institutional review board or ethics board that is involved with clearing the study protocol. But certain motivational strategies do exist for ensuring a limited non-response as possible. Leaflets could be delivered to sample households in advance to explain the survey and how they were selected, so again, reducing kind of a knowledge gap. And material incentives could be provided as a form of a thank you gift and acknowledgement of the value of the respondent's time. So this is not always an effective motivational tool, of course. It's especially problematic to give cash in the field, and certainly can pose a risk to interviewers who could be carrying a lot of cash to use as motivational tools. So that's something certainly that needs to be considered. Rather than cash, small gifts can be used as an incentive to participate in the study. These small gifts can be in kind and equivalent in value to the number of hours that the respondent is expected to participate. So for 2 hours of their time, what is more or less that worth, and valuing that through an in-kind payment like a t-shirt or packages with oil and sugar and tea, or other options depending on the context. The gift should really not relate to the intervention being measured. So if this is an evaluation of a health program, the motivational incentive should really not have any impact directly on health. So just keep that in mind, because we don't want to skew your study results. In addition, any benefits associated with the survey should be described in detail in the informed consent statement that's available. So any tangible or intangible benefits that can be expected from participation should be mentioned to the respondent at the beginning in order to try and motivate their participation in the survey. Fifth brings us to panel and time series surveys. These pose several challenges. First, we really need to build into the survey the ability to recontact the same households, the same individuals over time, depending on the number of rounds expected to be required for the study itself. This requires substantial methods for respondent tracking, such as inclusion of the GPS coordinates, phone numbers, other ways of contacting the respondents over time. Our goal here is, of course, to reduce attrition, which is the loss of respondents between survey rounds. So the reason why we could experience attrition could be due to objective realities, such as the household or the respondents have moved or simply are refusing to participate in the study in subsequent rounds. Or it could be due to the fault of the surveyors themselves, so poor documentation or inadequate contact information being collected in the first or early survey rounds, therefore not informing subsequent rounds, and the ability to follow up with households over time. So in short, of course, just like anything, have a strategy, make sure this is built into the work plan itself so that supervisors know how to respond to issues of attrition in the field. Are they doing any sort of sample replacement? What is the specific strategy that should be in place should attrition become an issue in the field?